Babes in Spyland. How Now, Sad Cow. Episode 10. The Secretary of Agriculture visibly shied away from the needle. His wide eyes took in the blue liquid before darting back up to stare, horrified, at Hans's face. What? Amphibian Queen resisted the urge to get as far away from the syringe as possible. She wished she knew more about the sad cow disease. Could humans contract it? If they did, would it kill them? Hurt them? Make them sad? And did the effects come on suddenly or slowly? A lack of information put her in a tough spot. How should she act? Get the secretary out? Let him take the shot so no one else had to? Or another solution? She racked her brain for the right answer as she watched. A predatory smile pulled Hans's lips into a wiry line. I always feel that simplicity is best, and this is no exception. If you do not give us the cure to SCD, then I will give you the disease, and you will be forced to make the cure known. You're insane, the secretary said. Hans shook his head. No, not at all. I told you, we are here to get results. There is no known cure. The secretary's voice lifted an octave. We're trying to develop one. His eyes searched the room, scanning faces. Maybe he was looking for support. Amphibian Queen noticed him take an excited breath when his eyes settled on CB. Him. Ask him. He's the one who's been working on the cure. He's our leading scientist on the matter. CB stared back at the secretary. His eyebrows knit together in a look Amphibian Queen hadn't seen before. Not fear, but concern. Tell them, the secretary said to CB. Tell them what you found. CB didn't answer immediately. After a moment, his Adam's apple bobbed and he swallowed. He turned his gaze away from Hans and looked around the room. Maybe y'all should sit down. Eyes narrowing, Hans threw a dirty glare at the other man. Shrugging, CB gestured toward the workbench. This'll take a bit. People might get tired. For a moment, no one moved. Then Hans jerked his head from the secretary toward the waiting chairs. Sit, he smiled. Everyone but the good secretary here. He's going to stand by me. The goon gave up his burden as Hans grabbed the secretary roughly by the arm and dragged him toward the table. Amphibian Queen willed CB to look at her. Maybe he hadn't seen her, or maybe he had and didn't want to call attention to her. Either way, she needed to get close to Hans, and she swallowed as fear tickled the back of her throat. That needle. Her captor began pushing her toward the chairs, and Amphibian Queen finally made eye contact with CB. She put on her best "a little help here" face and widened her eyes. CB got the message and gestured toward her. And bring that little lady up here, she's my assistant. The momentum stopped as her captor tried to work out what he should do. Hans regarded Amphibian Queen for the first time, taking her in from the top of her head down to the wispy shirt and tight pants, to the shoes and back up. She's your assistant? CB grinned like an idiot. Sure is, ain't you, honey? Amphibian Queen smiled, hoping it looked sincere. That's right. A buzzing sensation came from her phone, almost causing her to jump. That little signal meant she'd gotten through the block. With a shrug, Hans jerked his head, indicating for her holder to take her around the table. Hans and the secretary stayed on the other side. The chairs filled as everyone else sat. A quick inventory told Amphibian Queen that Hans had 10 goons with him, 7 with prisoners, and 3 more guarding the exits. One of them stood next to the hall that led to the bathroom, and she wondered if they knew about the tunnel from the garden. CB watched as she approached. He nodded to her captor. I'm gonna need her hands for ye. Hans shrugged his consent, and the goon released Amphibian Queen. Balling her hands into fists, and then stretching them back out, she took a step away from the guy. She thought about going for Hans, but there was a table between them, and he had that stupid needle pressed right up against the secretary's neck. Catching the malicious glint of light reflecting off the metal made her queasy. So, 60% of your cows have shown signs of SCD? CB asked Hans, calmly stepping away from his own goon and ignoring the fact that Hans stood ready to inject a government official with a potentially deadly disease. Yes. What symptoms have they displayed? Silence settled around her like a cold chill. Even in the precarious situation, Amphibian Queen found herself straining to make sure she heard every word. The cows sulk, Hans said. They do not eat as they once did, and when they do eat, oftentimes they will eat whatever is within reach. CB nodded, solemnly. Amphibian Queen wondered if cows normally ate whatever they came across, kind of like goats and some of the guys at the SSA. Hans went on. They resist moving and moo continuously. It was a few months ago that we discovered their milk no longer made acceptable chocolate. This time CB folded his arms across his chest and frowned, like a doctor listening to a patient's list of complaints. What made the milk unacceptable? Flavor, texture, and a lack of what our science call gumption. Gumption? Amphibian Queen had to choke back a laugh. Were they really standing here with Swiss misters, talking about sad cows and their gumptionless milk? Didn't anyone have better things to worry about, like terrorists, the gang of flasher rollerbladers going across country, or even the extreme croquet game outside? But the stern look on Hans's face, along with the set angle of his jaw, told her he meant every word. CB rubbed a hand over his mouth, scratching his cheeks with a thumb and forefinger, and nodded again. Sounds pretty typical. He turned to the crowd. Are these the same symptoms and effects that y'all have experienced? A few people nodded. Others narrowed their eyes in either suspicion or malice. Anyone else have different symptoms? CB asked. He shot Hans a placating look. We might be dealing with different strains. A woman raised her hand. A thick South American accent rode on her words. In our country, the cows get so sad they will lie down and die. 2 more heads bobbed in agreement. One of the livestock men Amphibian Queen had seen earlier raised his hand. My cows cry. His face twitched in sympathy. Big, rolling tears down their faces. The man next to him patted him on the shoulder. CB looked around. Anything else? When no one answered, CB stepped up to the table next to the microscope. A long, silver lid covered the spot in front of him. He gestured Amphibian Queen closer. We will now examine sad cow disease. He looked at the audience hopefully. I have a PowerPoint presentation if we want to start with that. No, Hans said, shaking his head. The cure. His face falling a bit, CB sighed. Fine. He pulled the lid off, revealing a pair of cooking tongs, 3 scalpels, and 3 different chocolates that sat on paper doilies. Saliva gathered in Amphibian Queen's mouth. Even with the room already smelling of chocolate, she could clearly tell that these specimens stood way above the rest. The sweet, rich aroma invaded her nose and tantalized her sweet tooth. These are chocolates from 3 different areas around the world. CB pointed at a lockbox sitting at the very end of the table. In order to keep them from being corrupted in any way, we had specialists gather the ingredients, including the milk, and handmade them. Each control sample came in earlier today via couriers that Social hired herself. He studied the crowd. 2 of them come from cows infected by SCD, 1 is virus-free. I will take samples and we can see the differences. I think y'all will find the results very interesting. Above and behind them, a projection of the table filled the wall. Like a cooking show, the audience could now see exactly what CB was doing. He selected a thin, sharp knife in one hand and a small pair of tongs in the other. He gently gripped the first chocolate with the tongs and sliced it in half with a scalpel. From there, he filleted the right section several times, ending up with paper-thin pieces. Slide, he said. When Amphibian Queen didn't move, he cleared his throat and repeated the word. Oh, right, she was the assistant. A quick glance at the table showed her what she needed, and she snatched up a small piece of thin, clear glass. She held it out as CB gently put the slice on it. He grabbed another slide and placed it on top. Then he squished them together like frosting between graham crackers, the chocolate oozing out the sides. He scratched the number 1 in black marker on it and handed it to Amphibian Queen, who set it next to the microscope. The second and third chocolates suffered the same fate. Once they'd finished, CB took the first slide and placed it on the little receiving tray under the microscope. The view of the table disappeared from the screen above, and the slide popped up on the projection. Amphibian Queen's mind tuned out CB's explanation as she studied the picture. Was there a smiley face in one of the cells? She blinked, and it went away. CB gave an explanation of the cells they were seeing, then switched the slide. The next sample looked the same. Amphibian Queen figured that they had looked at the 2 with SCD first, waiting to contrast the clean sample last. But when CB put the final slide on the tray, she felt a frown pull at the corners of her mouth, It looked exactly the same as the other two. She glanced at the crowd and then back at CB while chewing on the inside of her lip. He nodded, then turned toward the audience. He touched the edge of each slide, his finger coming into the shot. "Ladies and gentlemen," CB said, pointing at the screen, "I'm afraid I have some shocking news for y'all. There is no difference between the cells in these 3 pieces of chocolate. We can do the other tests, but I can assure you that they would come out with the exact same results." Shrugging, he turned his palms up. "You see, sad cow disease doesn't exist." A tumult of outrage and shock rose like a wave from the crowd and crashed into the table. It rolled over Amphibian Queen, who shot CB a look of "What are you doing?" before she took a step toward the secretary and Hans. Things were about to get crazy. CB held up his hands. "If all y'all would allow me to explain." No one did. The accusations started flying as people jumped to their feet, pointing and yelling in more languages than Amphibian Queen recognized. Hans, it seemed, did not like CB's announcement. He tightened his grip on the secretary and leaned close to the man's ear. "Mr. Secretary, your ploy will not work. You have a cure, and your government will give it to me." Amphibian Queen might be able to get over the table to the secretary in time to stop Hans's needle, but she wouldn't bet on it. Instead, she grabbed one of the scalpels, aimed, and threw it. Bullets weren't the only thing she could hit something with. Thanks to a nice man from a questionable circus in Turkey, she'd learned how to throw knives. The body has certain reflexes, and dropping things when you took a good shock was one of them. Hans obviously hadn't been expecting trouble at that moment. He stared, dumbfounded, at the scalpel sticking through his palm, and then at the needle, which fell toward the secretary. The secretary, bless his heart, screamed like a girl and batted the needle away as if attempting to rid himself of a vicious bee. The syringe arched through the air, quite gracefully, right toward the crowd. The people who hadn't turned around to accuse their neighbors of faking sad cow disease bolted backward, spilling chairs and other guests as they went. The screaming rose in pitch as the needle embedded itself into a marshmallow that had fallen onto the floor, hitting with a twang and standing on end. Amphibian Queen hoped someone would step on it. She had more immediate concerns to deal with. The secretary had wiggled free of Hans's good hand, but Hans yanked the scalpel out of his palm before he grabbed the secretary again. Amphibian Queen launched herself over the table, like an action star sliding across the hood of a car, and winced when she realized she'd just put her white pants through brown chocolate. That was going to look delightful. Hans saw her coming, and in a blur he twisted the secretary's arm, throwing him into a somersault. The politician landed hard on his back, his head rebounding off the wood floor like a basketball. Amphibian Queen went after Hans, knowing that eventually the secretary would thank her for saving his life. He might not be happy if he ended up with a dislocated shoulder, or worse, but he would thank her. Even with a hand and a leg occupied keeping the secretary down, Hans managed to fend off all of her attacks. He tried to sweep her legs and she darted back. His free hand disappeared into his jacket pocket and came out with another needle. Time stopped. Oxygen ceased to fuel her body. Her feet were stuck to the floor as if with epoxy. Hans was going to inject the secretary. She had to do something about it. If only she could move. "Come on," she muttered to herself. Suddenly, her phone buzzed again. That gave her an idea. Muscle memory took over, and her hand moved of its own accord. Hans removed the cover on the needle with his teeth. The walls seemed to close in around Amphibian Queen, but she was now on autopilot. Her hand shook as she retrieved her phone and swiped the screen to life. "Interference!" She'd meant to shout it, but the word barely cleared her lips. Still, it worked. Just before Hans plunged the needle into the secretary's exposed neck, a squealing sound, loud enough to make Amphibian Queen flinch, pierced the air. Hans's hand jerked to his ear, and a look of pain flashed in his eyes. The tech guys had come through again. Getting a screech through your earpiece always hurt. CB lunged out of nowhere, grabbed the secretary by the leg, and started to drag him away. Hans threw himself forward, needle first. Everything slowed down. Amphibian Queen noted the gush of blood coming from Hans's hand. She clearly saw the look of terror on the secretary's face, and somehow she managed to dive between the two men with her arms outstretched in front of her, as if she were trying to grab something off the floor. The mere sight of the needle so close turned her stomach and made her head swim. Any thought of a triumphant victory faded as the needle plunged into her arm. Her throat closed up in fear, and her whole body went tense. Even though CB claimed SCD was a farce, Amphibian Queen couldn't help but think that she might die. This is what they called Level 3, the Hail Mary Frappe. If the situation was sitting in a blender, then someone just tossed in yet another problem and hit the Frappe button. The only way out was a miracle, or a lot of luck, serious effort, and in general, something crazy. Liquid fire burned into her bicep as Hans, already in motion and unable to stop, depressed the end of the needle, and its contents shot into her bloodstream. Amphibian Queen grit her teeth together in order to keep from screaming. If sad cow disease was real, she was going to be pissed, and maybe dead.